So I'd like to thank my hosts here for the past several months, Klaus-Dieter Mattes, Thorsten Muck, Alexander Schiller, and others who have made this very quickly a home. It went by too fast, like life, and I'm really sad that I have to go away next week. Yeah. So thank you for making it a wonderful time here. And thanks to all of you for all the scholarship that you've produced. I literally could not have written this paper without the writings of many of you sitting right here. One day in 1760, Jigme Lingpa entertained a guest in his retreat at Chimpu, a yogi named Srinatha. They got to talking about philosophy, texts, and teachings. When the yogin questioned him about his knowledge of scripture, Jigme Lingpa had this to say, in what he calls playful verses. Tathāgatagarbha, the king of tantras, from Indra Bodhi and Lungtun Dorjit and Ngawang Chupel, I've seen something like 9 commentaries from India and Tibet. I even made a commentary on the ground, the continuum of being and Buddha nature, in my rocky cave. A better commentary than that I have never seen. Jigme Lingpa was born in 1730 and died in 1798. He is the author of 14 large volumes of philosophy, history, biography, poetry, and ethics. Both his visionary cycle of ritual and theology, as well as his major philosophical work, became fundamental to his school, the Nyingma school, in the centuries after his death. Though he rarely traveled beyond his home in the Chungye Valley, the Valley of the Tibetan Kings, his life and thought had a profound effect on intellectual practice across the Tibetan plateau. And today he remains widely read and discussed. But in 1760, he was just getting started. I made a commentary on Buddha nature in my cave. This is classic irony from Jigme Lingpa. Looking back from the vantage point of 1786, when he was completing the portion of his autobiography that recounts this episode, he is proud of his knowledge of scriptural commentary as a young man of 31, yet disparaging of that knowledge in relation to the work he was currently engaged in, the work of meditative retreat. The best commentary he has ever seen is no commentary at all. A prolific writer, he was quick to downplay an obsession with the written word. A lifelong scholar, he used humor and self-deference to critique the scholarly enterprise. But the stakes were always high, and humor was serious business for Jigme Lingpa. For in this playful verse, he signals a major issue that surfaces across his writings, namely the relationship between language and experience. Buddha nature is, for Jigme Lingpa, a key topic of debate within this more general concern, and it is as it most likely has been throughout the history of the idea. To illustrate this, today I'll take us through several distinct types of writing about Buddha nature in Jigme Lingpa's works. I hope to show that Jigme Lingpa's attempts to thread the narrow defile between negation and affirmation in Buddhist talk about the nature of reality afforded him the chance, or perhaps compelled him, to work creatively with the concept in multiple genres. We'll see Jigme Lingpa's antinomian approach to Buddha nature in the context of his formal expression of ontology in great perfection thought, as well as his more ephemeral bits of commentary, conversation, and opinion about Buddha nature that can be found scattered throughout his life writings and occasional pieces. And along the way, I hope we get a good sense of the places where we might find Buddha nature in Tibetan intellectual, institutional, and contemplative life, both in and out of formal philosophical discussion. We'll move in a rough chronology, starting with an episode from his autobiography in which he discusses Buddha nature with some of his Gelugpa neighbors. Then we'll look to his most important doctrinal work, The Treasury of Precious Qualities, in which he equates Buddha nature with ground in the great perfection sense. Next, we'll briefly touch on another episode in his autobiography where he recounts his efforts to prepare a Gelugpa tulku for a Nyingma-style meditation retreat. And finally, we'll hear his letter to spirits, where he brings Buddha nature and demons together in a perhaps unexpected way. Skirting the periphery of this discussion are ongoing questions about the practical value and strategic use of old concepts like Buddha nature in new contexts within the intellectual and creative lives of Tibetans in the past. So we'll start with a moment in the life of debate around the term. Jigme Lingpa's long autobiography of his life in central Tibet contains material that is interesting in its own right and also directly relevant to his more formal doctrinal writings. Let's listen to one medium-length passage to get a sense of what the autobiography can offer a discussion of Buddha nature. In 1779, Jigme Lingpa tells us, he was largely at his home monastery of Pema Uling, a small place situated up a minor vale ascending from the Chungye Valley that he founded in 1752. This year also found him working at his parent monastery of Pelri on the Chungye Valley floor, overseeing the liturgical calendar and some renovations. In the summer of 1779, he hosted a group of scholars from nearby Ngari Tratsang, the Gelugpa College founded by the second Dalai Lama in 1541. After participating in prayers and receiving a meal, the Gelugpa scholars began to ask him questions. The autobiography offers a succinct yet complex account of their visit, including a report of the conversation, an account of his thoughts while he was engaged in the conversation, and an exegesis on the topic of the conversation, including several references to scripture and classical doctrinal works. So let's read a portion of the passage, then pause to notion several features. And like the other translations I want to read, I'll include the translation of the entire passage in the later version of the paper. So here we go. Here's Jigme Lingpa. At Pelri Monastery, we largely passed the summer with crafting holy objects for the 10th day offerings, including a statue of Padmasambhava. The Buddhas of the 10 directions were placed within Pelri's chapel. A full 20 tea and noodle offerings were dedicated to monks during the renovation of the holy objects, and teachings on monastic conduct were inaugurated. When tea and noodles were offered to some monks from Ngari Tratsang, they asked for a teaching on the aspiration prayer of the Bodhisattva's way of life. These scholars, she refers to as geishes, from Ngari Tratsang with the Karmapa degree in 10 topics, had come to recite the 3 aspiration prayers. Additionally, since I was also faithful to the tradition of the great Buddhist vehicles, between sessions they requested that I give them vows for generating the intention for aspiration and action according to Lord Atisha's 7-point training in cause and effect. So far, so good. Since they had doubts about other texts, they asked about great perfection, the great perfection view of ground consciousness, and the Dharma body. And they were happy when I responded with the claims of the omniscient Longchenpa. Then they asked about the philosophical view of the great perfection. And here's what they ask. Is Buddha nature, it's always quote-unquote Tathāgatagarbha in his text, is Tathāgatagarbha in accord with ultimate truth? Does it exist as an actual thing in the nature of living beings? And here's what Jigme Lingpa thinks about this question. I thought to myself, well, even I understand that this is an attack on the Jonangpa, Dopapa, and Shakyamuni. It appears that no matter when they lived, one needs to drop them like a hot iron. And subsequent philosophical argument about them has been a dispute without parallel. And I thought, our view does not take the Jonangpa claim to be the best. I know all the views that establish the ground as an object of knowledge, and this one, the Jonangpas, cannot suffice for the source of the unproduced. However, Nagarjuna's refutations to objections against Madhyamaka says, without relying upon conventional language, it is not possible to realize the holy truth. So he's going to have an argument with them. And he actually gets the source wrong. This is a verse from the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, not the refutation to objections. Fine. And then he says to the scholars, Nagarjuna intended that such issues should be connected with scripture and reasoning. Additionally, when one is taking philosophical views into one's experience through meditation, since cognitive obstructions regarding the nature of the knowable are great, unimpeded good qualities do not rest in their natural state. That's our big problem, isn't it? As soon as one realizes that the primordially established philosophical view, the innate wisdom that is free from elaboration, does not require any work to be done, one becomes free of any assertion of great perfection. And he goes on. This does not reach the ears of the great scholastic teachers. Nevertheless, the ornament for realization states, here there is nothing to clarify. There is nothing at all to establish. Look truly at the truth. Seeing truly, one will be liberated. And he continues. Nevertheless, even Chapichuki Senge, who is good at teaching one type of Tibetan language, asserts that the ultimate truth is an object of words and thought. In terms of that claim, your Dharma language, in which a view that arises from the insights of learning and analysis imitates the words, is sufficient. Ouch. And he goes on. Padampa Sangye says, know that the wisdom in which the ultimate truth simultaneously arises is the result of only of the completion of the accumulations, the purification of the obscurations, and the blessings of a realized master. It is delusional to try and rely on any other means. Accordingly, the philosophical view, realized by the renunciant, who has both accumulated and purified in retreat, has practiced generation and perfection stage yogas, who has faith, and so forth, is like this. The way of the Bodhisattva says, the ultimate truth is not the domain of thought. Thought is explained to be erroneous, conventional truth. So, and here he concludes, it cannot be established through words. This is a very rich scene, in my opinion, at Pelri Monastery, circa 1779, and just one of many such scenes in the autobiography, as well as one of several that treat Buddha nature explicitly. We can learn something about philosophy in action from this passage by observing what, at least in Jigme Lingpa's reconstruction of the event, different parties take to be at stake when practicing philosophy. The Gelugpas seem to want to catch Jigme Lingpa out, to get him inadvertently to admit that the great perfection ideas about ontology are similar, if not identical, to the great scapegoat of their version of Madhyamaka thought, other emptiness. And it's, as told by Dolpapa, and its other quasi-heretical proponents, such as the 15th century master Shakyamuni. And of course, the trap lies in the term Buddha nature. If Jigme Lingpa asserts to their proposition that Buddha nature is really there in human nature, then he is a co-conspirator with Dolpapa and his misguided tradition. If he refutes the proposition, then he would be at pains to explain the importance of Buddha nature, language, and tradition in the great perfection thought, a possibility of which his Gelugpa audience may well be fully aware, and a problem that we'll see Jigme Lingpa grappling with in a moment. What makes this passage so interesting, however, is that Jigme Lingpa uses context of thought against the question his audience poses to him. Jigme Lingpa's basic move is to critique their claim to a transcendent philosophical discourse on several levels: historical, linguistic, social, rhetorical, etc. As he proceeds, what seemed at first to be a debate about ontology becomes, read through the autobiography, a debate about language use, about the limits of referentiality, and about the contextual limits of certain types of philosophical language. The group posing questions about Buddha nature imagined, we might say, that Jigme Lingpa would enter into the debate they began and proceed according to the rules they set forth, namely that Buddha nature is in fact a topic capable of being debated, capable of being assessed, critiqued, accepted, or rejected through reason and through language. But Jigme Lingpa refuses to play their game, at least in this context. More than that, the most serious charge he makes against his Gelugpa guests is that they do not realize that they are playing out a language game. They do not realize that their game has a history that defines its boundaries, one which can be traced back to one of their own founding figures, the 12th century Kadampa philosopher Chapachugyi Senge. They seem even to forget that his language critique is supported by such works as the Bodhisattva's Way of Life or Nagarjuna's writings, Buddhist classics that they themselves would regard as authoritative, that form the very backbone of their own philosophical enterprise. Well, if Jigme Lingpa is reticent to offer his own account of Buddha nature in conversation with his Gelugpa neighbors, where does he do so? And to find out, we need to move to his major work of mature scholarship, his 1780 work, The Treasury of Precious Qualities, which was written about a year after his meeting with these scholars from Ngari Chatsang. The Treasury is a structured presentation of the entire Buddhist path, taking the would-be Buddhist practitioner on a long journey, from the first steps in developing an ethically oriented self-consciousness all the way to complete integration with an ultimately benevolent cosmos. And if we open part 2 of his commentary, The Chariot for Omniscience, and turn the page to chapter 11, verse 1, we find the following claim. In the second turning of the wheel, the Buddha taught 3 doors to liberation. The essential point to be taught here is self-cognizing wisdom. Self-cognizing wisdom naturally exists in the continua of sentient beings as Buddha nature. This is called great perfection. There's a lot of synthetic work going on in this verse, as well as in Jigme Lingpa's commentary to it. First of all, in one fell swoop, Jigme Lingpa integrates the second and third turnings of the teaching by equating the subject of emptiness-centered and anti-referential analysis known as the 3 doors of liberation. It's the second turning, with a more fulsome vision of a self-referential enlightened wisdom, the third turning. He then makes clear that the wisdom at the end of the path is, of course, the Buddha nature at the beginning of the path. Finally, he makes a simple statement: Buddha nature is known as great perfection. This claim is a variation on a theme to be found since at least the writings of Longchenpa and through to the writings of Mipam. Jigme Lingpa expresses the idea with directness here. Buddha nature is great perfection. In the stark equation of these two, Buddha nature and great perfection, puts Jigme Lingpa in an interesting position to argue for his vision of great perfection, which he will elaborate over the final 3 chapters of the Treasury of Precious Qualities and the next 500 pages of its commentary, The Chariot for Omniscience. He needs to get Buddha nature right. To do this, he needs to walk the razor's edge between utter non-referentiality, which I think he and his Gelugpa counterparts might agree on in principle, if not in application, and the need to say something about the ultimate, if only as a heuristic for contemplative training and practice. This he does with the help of the 3 doors of liberation, namely that the ideas that ultimate reality, and by extension Buddha nature, has 1, neither essence, 2, nor attributes, and is therefore nothing to aspire to or to wish for, 3. He also needs to avoid possible critiques that his Buddha nature and his great perfection are real objects out there or in there or somewhere, or that if they are not quite real objects, that they are forms of awareness that come too close to unenlightened consciousness, which entails a subject and an object. Let's read an excerpt from his commentary in which he addresses one of these issues. He begins by putting words in the mouth of an imagined opponent, after which he offers some responses to this opponent. So here's his version of what an opponent might say to him. Some say that either that Buddha nature exists as a material object, and the term here is bembo, in the constitutions of sentient beings, or that it exists as a kind of cognition, rikpa. In the former proposition, Buddha nature is similar to the self posited by non-Buddhists. But you, I think this is his opponents talking to him, you, Jigme Lingpa, also do not want to posit that this unknowable thing exists as a physical form, so you teach that no one can see it. And in the later proposition that this is a kind of cognition, Buddha nature becomes constructed because it exists with the 8 forms of consciousness. And so here's his response, the beginning of his response. It's much longer, and this is just a portion of it. There is no refutation of Buddha nature from the first critique, that is the critique of materialism. The feature, that is the measurement of the size of Buddha nature construed as material object, does not actually exist from the viewpoint of the 3 doors of liberation. It is the unknown thing. This is the unknown thing of the non-Buddhist and is not asserted as a quality of the enlightened body or of wisdom. And he quotes a series of quotes from the Lankavatara Sutra to support this claim, many of which will be familiar to many of you from Longchenpa and especially from Mipam. But then he goes on to the second critique, which I think is more serious for him, that it's a form of cognition that's we can equate in some way with the 8 forms of consciousness. And he writes, the second is also not a refutation of Buddha nature. A feature of Buddha nature is that it is free from all proliferation, like the sun. Much of this will sound familiar to you. This sun is hidden in clouds. It is inside what is to be cleared away, namely clouds or the adventitious defilements, which are the substantial cause of the nature of samsara, and as well as the 8 forms of consciousness, including the base consciousness. And these are cleared away on the path of mantra with profound means such as initiation or creation and completion yogas. The Srimala Devi Sutra says, Lord, when the Dharma body of the perfect Buddha is not liberated from the adventitious covering, it is referred to as Buddha nature. So in response to the first critique, Jigme Lingpa sets the 3 doors of liberation to work explicitly on Buddha nature, merging the second and third turnings into a single whole, and thereby bringing an emptiness-based analysis to bear on Buddha nature. But in response to the second, that it is a form of unenlightened cognition, he has got to save appearances because he needs to retain the idea of consciousness as a kind of ever-present energy, but he can't have any trace of subject-object duality in enlightened awareness, either in seed or in full bloom. So to do this, he resorts to classic metaphors drawn from the long tradition of Buddha nature thought. And he also brings language from the Great Perfection tradition to bear on Buddha nature as he continues this passage. And he goes on. In particular, because Buddha nature is not altered from great perfection, is free of the proliferation of mind and mental events as quiescence in the sphere of reality, is free of activity as self-originating wisdom, is self-resting and self-abiding as a continuum of magnificent transcendence from thought. Because of this, the manifesting adventitious defilements naturally vanish. And in the ensuing chapters of The Chariot for Omniscience, as well as in earlier works, such as The White Lotus from the early 1760s, Jigme Lingpa elaborates on great perfection, thought, and practice, which now becomes a way to talk about Buddha nature with the particular aesthetic of Dzogchen writing. And Jigme Lingpa evokes this great perfection inflected Buddha nature in quite a few places throughout his corpus. Some episodes in his biography, such as his lecture to the scholars from Ngari Tratsang, offer a glimpse of the moments of a social and intellectual life where Buddha nature might have been a topic of intense conversation in 18th century Tibet. Another, which I'll just refer to briefly from his autobiography, provides a sense of how Buddha nature might figure in teaching sessions for a retreat. In the late 1780s, he prepares another Gelugpa, a student, the Gonsei Tuku from Tsona in the south of the Chongye Valley, and he lists several possible topics for study prior to engaging in formal meditation. And he writes, if the teacher is an expert in explaining the continuum of being in terms of mantra, one learns and contemplates continuum as a name for the continuum of existence, then one analyzes this. Then one differentiates the ground, continuum, Buddha nature, the 8 forms of consciousness. Then one undertakes an introduction to the mind. Enhancement to that is facilitated with the third empowerment, and so forth. And he was referring here in his autobiography to a teaching that we have elsewhere in his collected works given to Gonsei Tuku. So in the, let's see here. In the longer passage of this section of his autobiography, we hear Jigme Lingpa lamenting in some detail about the negative effects of too much analytically intensive philosophizing for meditation. In the context of meditation training, Buddha nature talk figures as a caution against a certain kind of language practice, a kind of over-analysis that, in Jigme Lingpa's estimation, not only misses the crucial grounding function of Buddha nature in assessments of one's meditation process, but may well actively inhibit work with other aspects of cognition, emotion, and experience more generally. It is perhaps in the spirit of his general critique of analysis as a useful approach to Buddha nature that Jigme Lingpa worked the idea into other forms of writing, types of writing that perhaps resist analysis, such as poetry and alternative styles of prose. And here we come to my last example. Like the playful verses that we began with about his commentary in the cave, or no commentary in the cave, such writings blend philosophy, aesthetics, and literary creativity in thoughtful ways. So to conclude, let's listen to portions of his Letter to Spirits, a sort of pseudo-epistle to demons, ghosts, and other harmful spirits who turn out to be none other than Buddha nature. He begins with the ontological setting, employing 2 terms, encompasser and encompassed, kapche and kapcha, to set up a relationship between Buddha nature and the world of appearance, the world of flesh. And he begins, awareness, Buddha nature, the encompasser, and upon this, the persistent collections of consciousness, the encompassed. Through the external influence of the encompassed, false visions dawn within the continuum of your being. And here he moves quickly to what you might call the real world, effects of adventitious defilements, namely spirits. They are 8 spirits, some common, some distinctive. They do not hold the presence of the teacher. They do not behold the presence of the teacher, the Buddha. They will not be bound under a pledge to the master, the second Buddha. To vicious, impetuous spirits who do not know the ethics of the good lay devotee. To spirits of strife who come and go suddenly. To harmful spirits swollen with a fondness for savage beliefs and arrogant towards the Dharma. To spirits of the dead, to the spirits possessing the living, to the wanderers, to you I write a letter. And he then moves to more traditional territory, offering advice and basic Buddhist ethical teachings, Buddhist ethical starting points to these spirits, as one might to a lay leader in a quote-unquote real letter. And he goes on, all sentient beings cycle through the 6 destinies and the 3 realms along paths of certain and uncertain cause, tendency, and mechanism. All sentient beings have been each other's father, mother, friend, teacher. Not a single person is not connected through love and through hate. And you, spirits, encounter parents and relatives with retaliation. Now, after further admonitions to spirits in general, he takes a turn from Buddhist ethics and jumps to the world of Tibetan demonology, offering the reader a list of no less than 14 specific types of harmful spirits. Now, these are all names of deities, I suspect, though I have not been able to locate most of them in other literature. But what is clear from the letter itself is that their names describe their actions. In this sense, maybe we think of these as epithets. These are the dangers in the environmental and emotional worlds that we inhabit daily. Together they present an unsettling vision of human life in its frailty. And here's his list of 14. Mischievous thief, robbing the radiance of beauty, harming the potency of a portion of food, slow disease, plague, and calamity, avalanche and mountain flood, masters of nature in both mountains and valleys, hail and drought, kikang, thunder in the sky, planet and serpent meeting face to face, speech of strife, thief of one's only surviving child, host of hail demons, lover of hate in governments, mutual attack, and finally, my favorite, vomit launch. That's my favorite because it was the name of a West Coast punk band in the 1990s. Finally, two worlds have come together. I find this to be a chilling passage, the litany of dangers listed out in workmanlike fashion, yet set before a backdrop of universal benevolence that is just beyond reach, Buddha nature. It is a powerful combination of horror and the sublime. As we read this list of the letter's dangerous addressees, killers all, we must remember that they are, in a sense, Buddha nature. For while spirits, Jigme Lingpa writes, the spirits Jigme Lingpa writes to are direct manifestations of the 8 forms of consciousness that cover Buddha nature, they are but the encompassed, or perhaps the pervaded, while Buddha nature is the encompasser, or the pervader. This is a deeply psychologized version of Tibetan chthonic spirits, where the malevolent forces of earth and sky are but outward expressions of consciousness. It is also a deeply aestheticized example of Buddha nature, where its originary and enveloping power is evoked in the literary form of an imagined letter to imagined beings, imagined here in the sense that they are nothing more or less than the outward projection of our inner cognitive and emotional lives. It is here that perhaps we see Jigme Lingpa responding to the shadow question of Buddha nature discourse, namely, if the cosmos is good, why and how do we have it so bad? Is it worth considering that the letter, for instance, as a form of creative writing that thrives on the conceit of intimate address, may be a distinctly productive place to consider experience when compared to more structured forms of writing in which talk about the experience of suffering is so tightly wrapped around Buddha nature conceived of as an intellectual problem? At any rate, to bring the letter to a close, Jigme Lingpa reveals the location from where he sent his letter to spirits. And this place is none other than Lanka, the island kingdom of the Divan Ravana, the setting, of course, of the Lankavatara Sutra, classical source of the doctrines and demonic spirits that animate the letter, Buddha nature included. Buddha nature discourse occurs through multiple kinds of writing and in multiple contexts. Tracking Buddha nature through genres such as autobiography, synthetic philosophical presentation, contemplative instruction, and other creative forms of literature suggests further that this discourse transcends a binary distinction between thought and practice and extends to the emotional, the aesthetic, to the therapeutic even, to a range of personal, interpersonal, and social moments both historically and potentially in the present. Tracing the discourse across the full range of writings within a single author's corpus is one way to efficiently discern this variety of meaning in relation to context, and may be useful as we try and understand the rich life of Buddha nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting excursion to the world of spirits. Are there any questions, comments, additions?
Could you say a little bit more about the Lankavatara, the content of the Lankavatara Sutra and the letter? Like, is he, how closely is he taking?
He's not. It's really it occurs only in the last line, right? And he says, he doesn't actually name an agent for the letter. So he's not Jigme Lingpa in Lanka. Right? It just says sent from the island of the 10-headed demon king, Lanka. Yeah. So the sender of the letter is left maybe productively ambiguous. You know, maybe it's Ravana, right? Maybe it's Buddha. Yeah. That one took me a while to figure out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just really enjoyed your presentation. I think one thing it illustrates is the need to look beyond sort of philosophical presentations of topics like Buddha nature. I think what you find is that the communicative persona of the author changes a lot. It's not this sort of disengaged or mediated type of presentation, but rather, in dialogue with particular people, different sort of ways of looking at a subject come out that wouldn't otherwise be found. I found when we were working on Mikyu Dorje that if we got a bit tired of his dry, pedantic, scholastic style, if you went to his Dreeland, where he's, in dialogue with particular students, often, the key points he's making were much clearer. Suddenly it was, and also you get, like you said, you find that the context of being in dialogue with the particular interlocutor shapes the way that he'll address the subject. So I thought it was really great, and it made me want to look into these things more.
Well, I wonder if looking to other atypical kinds of literature, if you can find moments where they show their work, or they show their work in a different light, then you go back to the more formal writing, and maybe you have a sense of the urgency that animates that kind of writing and debate as well, too. Whereas sometimes it's very difficult to tell what their stake in this is. Yeah. So it's not that it provides the better view, right? It's I think now that we have so much electronic text and so many beautiful collected works that are nicely edited and easily readable, we have this opportunity that we didn't a generation ago to get a real well-rounded picture of people like Mikyu Dorje or Jigme Lingpa through their sungbums, through their collected works. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot for your fascinating speech. Just, I'm very curious whether at some other point Lingpa goes into a possible correlation between these demons and afflictions.
I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking. Yeah. There's another. He writes another letter to demons too, so he cares about it. And I was going to work that one in. I was having so much trouble with it, and I thought, oh my gosh, where's all this vocabulary coming from? And then I learned that it was, I realized that it was a kakaganga poem, it was an alphabet poem, and I'd been so focused on the demonology terms that I hadn't realized that he was screwing with me, and he was using the weirdest terminology possible to get the alphabet out there in front. So anyway, I couldn't present that one here, yeah. Yeah.
It says as traditional enumeration of 8 kinds of spirits and demons.
Yeah.
This is
But then he gives 14, very different, yeah.
And
Yeah.
8
Yeah.
normally enumerated are not included.
No, no, it's, I mean, in that sense, I think, I see this letter like this, it's, maybe these were things he did at the end of the day, right? If we right? But we can track some of the letters and some of his occasional pieces through his autobiography, and so we know when and where, but I haven't found this one yet. Haven't found an audience other than the demons themselves for this one. Yeah.
And I enjoyed your talk very much, and particularly the first antidote with the Gelugpa coming. It reminded me of also like Milarepa, the Geshe coming to see Milarepa in a way like this. And your point about, and that David reiterated, like the different forms of language, not buying into a particular logic, but Tathāgatagarbha is often described, narrative or poetics. But I was particularly interested that he raised the Jonam in that and distanced his tradition from the tradition. I know you're working on a big book on him. I'm wondering this comes up again, where he's distinguishing his view from this and naming the Jonah?
Probably a couple other times in the autobiography, because there are multiple scenes like this. But he doesn't take it on in any formal way, though. Yeah, which is, from one perspective, disappointing, right? Because you think that he probably could have. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But talk to me in a year or two. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Is it kind of your research project where you want to further investigate Jigme's position, or he's dealing with the Tathāgatagarbha, or just one time?
So what I'm interested in is how scholars go about their work. Unlike many of you who are so focused on particular philosophical problems, I have to rely on your work, but I want to know something about the person and what that person cared about. In that sense, I'm a sort of a historical realist, because I do believe we can make claims about what people did, and we can make productive suggestions about what they thought and felt, too. And we're lucky in a time and place like Central Tibet, 18th century, to have a lot of different resources, right? We have a person here who's looking back in 2 points, because basically the autobiography is in 2 big chunks that he wrote, right? Looking back at his life and deciding what to tell you, deciding what matters that he's going to express to his readership. And I find those moments fascinating. So, but that's my project. Yeah. Yeah.